So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to What's in a Name? I am David Horton, your host today, representing the Adult Programs Committee at First Parish. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to thank our techie today, Omar Kudari, and acknowledge the work of Don Cohen, Meg Newhouse, and Ruth Rose to bring the Tuesday afternoon series to First Parish, and to thank all of the presenters participating in the series that we've had and that will be coming up in the next 2 weeks. Here's how we'll operate today after the presentation. If you have questions to ask after the presentation, you can write them in chat, click on reactions in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and then click on raise hand, or just physically raise your hand. We'll catch you somewhere. And now for the main event. What's in a name, you ask? Shakespeare channeled his answer to that very same question through Juliet Capulet in Act 2, Scene 2 of his play Romeo and Juliet. 400 years later, the question is still being asked. We all relate positively to certain ways of being addressed in ways we would not like to be addressed. Today, we'll have the rare opportunity to hear what Reverend Kathleen Hepler, Pratik Mamtora, and Mia Roop learned after 4 hours of conversation pondering that question. They want to share that experience with us because they all agreed that it is integral to decentering whiteness and making space for new paradigms. So now let me introduce them. First, Reverend Kathleen Hepler is our esteemed and valued sabbatical parish minister. Pratik Mamtora is currently communications director and a religious education teacher at First Parish. He has been a part of UU congregations for over a decade as a religious education assistant, director of family ministry, administrator, communications director, and lead classroom teacher. His caring and kind-heartedness is exemplified by his enthusiastic approach to all his endeavors. An avid fan of classic TV shows like I Love Lucy, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. He loves to read, write poetry, and spend time with his Pomsky dog, Kashmir. Mia Roop has been and still is the indefatigable and resourceful interim office manager at First Parish for 4 months and is a 15-year member of First Parish. And now for our program, go ahead, Reverend Kathleen, Pratik, and Mia.
Thank you, Dave, and everyone who's put these Tuesday talks together. We're really glad to be here and that there was space. Pratik and Mia and I decided to find out a way to share what we had experienced in our conversations over the last couple months, which we did not necessarily expect would happen. But I think I can speak for them in saying that all three of us found very profound and somewhat difficult and also very authentic as we talked about this issue of what we call one another and what happens when cultures might not agree about the essence of what we call one another. And so for us, this is about experiencing, not just learning in a workshop, but actually experiencing the opportunity to be able to talk about these things. And I wanted to thank Mia and Pratik for being willing and being courageous in our 4 to 5 hours that we've spent together since January on this very topic. We would talk for a while and then go away and think about it and come back and talk about what we learned and so forth. That's been our process. So how we're going to do this today is each of us will share where we were in our being and our thinking when, before we really talked about the issue. And then we'll each go around, we'll go around again and we'll each talk about what we learned. And then we'll open it up to questions or comments, conversation. And so beginning today, talking about where he was when he sat down in that chair, our first staff meeting last January, Pratik will begin, and then Mia will go next, and I'll go third. Over to you, Pratik.
Thank you, Reverend Kathleen. I started working for First Parish in August of 2020. At the time, the building was closed and all of our programming was online. In my initial staff meetings over Zoom, I discussed with Reverend Ann, my supervisor, and Rip and Lisa Maria, my colleagues, about how I would address our congregants. My choice was to use formal language, and it also helped me to create boundaries. As a professional, I like to use language that is well thought out, planned, and shows a level of official agency. I want to be able to be deliberate in my language, use protocol and a format with a touch of sophistication, and reserve the informal, casual language in my personal life when I can use colloquial language and slang among family and friends. Part of my culture and upbringing was about being respectful, especially towards elders. I could never call my grandma by her first name alone. She is Sharda Ba. There is always an honorific that goes along. The Sanskrit phrase, Guru Devo Bhava, teaches me to regard my teachers and leaders as gods and goddesses. I could meet my first grade teacher today and still would not feel comfortable calling her by her first name. She will always be Sister Teresa to me. I also come from a large joint family with many uncles, aunts, and cousins. As a child, I was always taught to show my respect by calling them Babu, Dada, Kaka, Kaki, Bhai, or Ben. Having been part of that culture, it just comes naturally to me to refer to people by their last name with an honorific. After a failed brief stint with another candidate, Ms. Mia Roop joined us as the interim office manager. Ms. Roop was also the board clerk at the time, a longtime member of the congregation and mother to our youth coordinator, John Roop. So when Ms. Roop approached me with the issue of how I address her, I was taken back to the moment when I had made the decision to use formal language. She insisted I call her Mia. The dominant culture was expecting me to do something that they felt was right. I was left to defend my choices. My way of communication was seen as problematic. Every day, I was put on the spot with yet another argument with the same and only solution in mind. On a couple of occasions, Ms. Roop also said that she's going to make me stop and convert to what she felt was right and the only way. She even entertained the thought of doing a congregation-wide poll of how I ought to address our parishioners. I was expected to assume goodwill while being intimidated and interrogated. I was posed with the personal gender pronouns and how I would adhere to a parishioner's request for that. I thought about it and how a person could perceive my way of showing respect as inappropriate, awkward, or even arrogant. That defeated my goal of expressing my regard and respect to that person. I'm a feminist. Historically, women have been kept away from being educated or having jobs and careers. Women clergy was an anomaly at one point too. Patriarchy has been a norm in many cultures around the world. The objectification of women and reducing them to being pretty faces, which had nothing to do with their skills or qualification. So the feminist in me has always wanted to lift up my female peers and acquaintances. So anytime I learn that a congregant has earned a PhD in their field, it is my way of lifting them up by calling them, Dr. Cami Thomas or Dr. Gabriela Musculo, Dr. Rita Bourne, especially those who identify as women. It is my way of showing respect that I am here in service of the congregation's need. I also lived in the South, Florence, Alabama, for my grad school. I was introduced to Southern hospitality and how people said, sir and ma'am, even when talking to a 5-year-old. It reminded me of our first principle, the inherent dignity and worth of every person. As a classroom teacher, I get to work with our younger UUs and always feel like I am learning something from them. People have asked me if they would like to call me Mr. Ma'am Torah. My response is, Sure, if that makes you feel comfortable, or you can follow your culture and I can follow mine.
Okay. So when I started to interact with Pratik, I noticed that he was calling me Mrs. Roop. And even though I asked him to call me Mia, he continued to call me Mrs. Roop. And then when I became the interim office manager and started working with him, he continued to call me Mrs. Roop, and it continued to be increasingly bothersome for me. I also started to notice that when he interacted with other parishioners, that many of them were doctors, and I had no idea they were doctors. Dr. Tasker, Dr. Hartman, Dr. Mulready Schick, Dr. Rosen were just a few. I approached Pratik and to discuss this and to explain my frustration, and he said that it was part of his culture to call people by their formal name. And I was still fixated on this issue and was looking for reasons I could bring to Pratik to change his practice. And it literally kept me up at night. At this time, I was actively testifying in front of the Massachusetts legislative groups in support of persons of color in Boston and in the Massachusetts prison system. And I was reading the book Caste. So I came to him with a new reason to stop. A darker skinned person calling a lighter skinned person by a formal name was a form of caste. And I said that his reason being that he was doing it due to his Indian culture was in fact one of the original caste systems. Another reason he gave was that he spent time living in Southern United States where people were often also called by their formal names. So I told him that that practice in the Southern United States was also based on a caste system with Black people and brown people at the bottom. And finally, I was grasping for anything, and I childishly told him that I was going to start calling him Mr. Montura because I was going to try anything to get him to stop. Since he refused to make the change, I talked to Reverend Ann, who separately asked him to consider making a change when he returned from his vacation in January. So I couldn't wait to get back in January to hear him call me Mia. But in January, he said he was not going to make the change. In our first staff meeting with Reverend Kathleen, I brought it up. I was surprised that Reverend Kathleen allowed us to talk about it for a long time, each of us getting to listen fully to each other's feelings. Throughout the conversation, Kathleen pointed out things that I hadn't even considered, and Pratik talked more fully about his reasons and his personal history. We also discussed not only racism, but ageism and how younger people often call elders by their formal names. I talked about how I didn't like being referred to so formally, and that it was important to be respectful to call people by the name that they wanted to be called. I said I felt it was perpetuating the caste system and racism, and I also talked about the UU's second principle, justice, equality, and compassion in human relations. And I even talked about how I was uncomfortable finding out who was a doctor in our church when I felt like we were all equals here. Kathleen?
So as Mia said, this was my first week and my first staff meeting, actually my first day at First Parish. And I had, up until that moment, participated in many, many workshops, read many, many books over many years about race and white privilege more recently, and white fragility and all those things, and knew about the eighth principle, and that First Parish was committed to working on it. Also, my family is interracial, so I've had sort of education in that way as well. So if you don't know Mia very well, I want to say I'm grateful for her directness, because that was the first thing on the agenda in our meeting that day. And as you just heard, Mia brought up the fact that she did not wish Pratik to use Mrs. in front of her name. I knew from a little bit of a conversation with Anne that this was a discussion going on in the congregation with Mia and with a few other people as well. I did recognize this as an opportunity, even though I felt nervous about the conversation. I thought, here's the thing, that if we are committed to eighth principle work, I think we have to commit to pausing for these conversations whenever something arises, when people are actually willing to have the conversations, which these two people were. It is usually not convenient, in my experience anyway. It usually is not much more than an intellectual thing in a curriculum, and usually not on a meeting agenda. So I said, here we go, and there we went. And now Pratik will talk about his learnings over the 4 or 5 hours that we've conversed about this. Pratik.
Thank you, Reverend Kathleen. So earlier I shared how I was, when the conversation started, and then after, some reflection and thinking and more conversations, I learned a few things, and I also had some takeaways. So here's what I would like to share. In the beginning, I felt deeply hurt that a white person can claim to be an expert in my culture by reading a book and demand I change my ways to cater to their ultimatum. A white person who may have never lived in the South or in India was choosing to ignore my educational wisdom, my ancestral wisdom, my lived experience, my heritage, and my legacy. I learned that there was no caucus group at FBLEX for me. The former allyship that Reverend Anne had expressed was pulled back because somebody felt strongly about it. I felt powerless. I felt oppressed. I felt alone. I learned that even as we yearn to expand our circle, I, as a BIPOC person, will go through the judgment, uncooperation, hurt, microaggression, heartbreak, frustration, trauma, and suffering. It is like the heel of a loaf of a bread. Everybody touches it, but nobody wants it. The tennis match between me and Miss Rue, and it turned into a circular conversation with Reverend Kathleen's guidance. I started calling Miss Rue Miss Mia and graduated to calling her Mia. I'm grateful to Mia for her courage, persistence, and openness. I was surprised and extremely glad that Reverend Kathleen created a safe space for us to have a restorative circle. She became a container to hold the uncomfortable conversations. As a trio, we all got to broaden our understanding through shared discernment. In spite of the initial discomfort, I saw restorative justice and transformation in action. I remember Lisa Maria reiterating in a Zoom meeting with fellow parishioners where I referred to them by their last name and they corrected me. She said, Pratik will do what Pratik feels comfortable with. I felt validated at that moment. It was liberating and accepting. On one occasion, Dr. Tony Tasker even mentioned that it's part of Pratik's charm. I learned not to let adversity, ignorance steal my joy. I learned not to let dominant culture, white supremacy, or oppressive environments steal my joy. I learned that I have agency in maintaining a sense of self-worth. I learned to celebrate myself even when I was standing alone. I get to practice patience, resilience, compassion, and magnanimity. Today, I stand my ground with wisdom, resilience, creativity, pride, and excellence.
Mia.
So the takeaways that I came away with from this was that it was extremely surprising to me that at the very end of that meeting, after 2 hours of listening and talking, Pratik said that he would call me Mia, that it would be hard for him, but that he would do it. And I understood Pratik was doing it just for me, not for the congregation. But that meeting had brought up so many ideas and I hadn't thought about before that I really wasn't sure what to think. So what might have been considered a victory for me, he was now calling me Mia, and now just brought new questions and thoughts. To set me off balance, it set me off balance that I thought I was doing the right thing, but now that was in question. It was pointed out that here I was from the dominant culture asking someone from a non-dominant culture to do something that I thought was right. It was crazy to think that I was being called out for the very thing that I was calling somebody out for. But here I was, a white person trying to fix things because white people think that they have all the answers, even for the white supremacy that they cause. I also heard from Pratik that he was from many or several marginalized groups and that he held fast to calling people by their formal names. I realized that I was trying to take something away from him that was deeply a part of him, something that he was proud of, something that he felt defined him. So I tried to think about things that were deeply part of me, like that I am Jewish. And I knew that if someone asked me to denounce that I was Jewish, I would refuse. I also thought about something that Kathleen had pointed out in the meeting, which was that he was doing something out of respect that was in fact being disrespectful. On the other hand, she mentioned that less marginalized people should give way to more marginalized people. And this totally resonated with me. I want to be an ally to anyone who does not have the same privilege that I was born with. In the end, I realized that this was deeply important to Pratik, and that by asking him to change this one thing, I was actually asking him to change a huge part of himself. I am still not comfortable with him calling people by their formal name, but I realized that it is who Pratik is, and I am no longer fixated on it. In fact, I don't even think about it anymore. Believe me, I really, it doesn't even come up for me. I do want to say that as we've been through this process, and we've discussed this, and the conversation has moved.
Omar, excuse me, Omar, I think you need to mute yourself. There's some static. There you go.
As we went on and continued to talk about this over time, I realized that Pratik, what he said, the language that he used has become stronger and stronger until it was actually this morning that we were practicing this, and it was the strongest language that he's used. And I have to say, I was sitting on the couch, just uncomfortable. It was the most uncomfortable I had felt about this whole process. But I think that this is an ongoing process. I had to sit back. I had to make myself, recognize that I was possibly, feeling defensive, and to stop it and to listen and to try to understand how other people feel and what is important to other people. Kathleen?
So my learnings and takeaways, I learned in a really important way for myself that as a white person, even though as a woman, I understand marginalization too, but that as a white person, it's probably always a good idea to ask myself where white-centeredness and privilege are present in any situation in my living, but especially situations like in this conversation. And this is something that I learned about through a workshop about decentering whiteness and white fragility and all of those things. It is usually obvious to the person of color, probably always obvious. And I might be, because of the framework of the dominant culture, which is a white framework, I might be oblivious unless I consider it and or ask the other person. I learned that if a white person and a person from a marginalized group disagree about behavior in a pluralistic setting, I think that I've learned to believe that it's up to the white person to be curious, to ask questions, to be eager to learn, and to give way if possible. I was surprised when we discovered, this might have been maybe the most delightful piece for me, that both Mia and Pratik shared UU values around social equality, and each of their viewpoints embraced that. Mia felt that Pratik calling her by a title put him in a one-down position, and she, as a UU, didn't like that. And she spoke, as she said, of the class system in India and the American South. Pratik, on the other hand, felt that asking him to change something that was so integral to his culture was a question of white privilege, and that embracing non-white people in Unitarian Universalism would require us to adapt and respect And when he said maybe even celebrate differences, that was a key moment for me. Celebrate, not just abide or tolerate, but celebrate. I was reminded that sometimes conflict is not resolvable in the usual way, or maybe we'd say maybe the dominant culture way, which would be a debate where someone's good idea or ideas win out. But when respectful conversation ensues, something that I'll call compassion can expand with understanding. And we all noticed the original issue becomes less charged. Neither person may change ultimately, but the relationship is improved and less charged. And I found this to be, and Pratik mentioned once, there are often many solutions to one problem. So I found this right here, what I just said, that with understanding and compassion, then the issue itself becomes less charged. And it goes to taking, the last thing I'll say that I learned, I'm sure there are more for all of us, but is that these kinds of conversations take a lot of time. And we don't really live in a culture where people feel they have this kind of time. And I don't have anything erudite to say about that. It's just something that is true, I think. You can't just have a half-hour discussion and make a decision. It has to be a sit down. I see some people nodding. Yeah, so that's important, I think. All right, I think, oh, and one more thing about the moment when any of us are reactive to something, reactive in the sense that something's said and it's so far from what you think or feel that you get this feeling of reactivity, and learning to manage that in these conversations, and even say I'm being reactive right now, I'd like to explore that, was a good reminder for me. So that's what we have to say. We decided on this reading just to end our piece of it by Audrey and Rich. It isn't that to have an honorable relationship with you, I have to understand everything or tell you everything at once, or that I can know beforehand everything I need to tell you. It means that most of the time I am eager, longing for the possibility of telling you, that these possibilities may seem frightening, but not destructive to me, that I feel strong enough to hear your tentative and groping words, that we both know we are trying all the time to extend the possibilities of truth between us, the possibility of life between us. So that's the end of the presentation part, and I think Dave is going to kind of manage the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, the three of you, very, very much. So now's the time for, if you have a question or comment, to either to raise your hand physically so I can see it on the screen, or place it in chat and it'll be read there, or under the reaction button icon at the foot of your screen, click on that and there's a raise hand icon and phrase that you can click on too.
Margaret Brooke has her hand up.
Okay, Margaret, unmute and you have the screen.
So can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
This is probably very wrong of me to bring this up at this point, because it really has little to do with what you people have been talking about, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. But I have a friend who goes to Fallen Church where their badges with their names on them say the pronouns they'd like to be known by. We have Katie O'Hare Gibson, who says Katie O'Hare Gibson, she, her. And at fallen, it's a given. Everybody names their pronouns. And as I say, I probably shouldn't bring it up. It has nothing to do with what's been said here earlier, but I wondered if anybody had any thoughts about that. And it can happen at another time. I understand the sort of inappropriateness of it right now.
Would you like to
Well,
ask our presenters if they have an opinion about it, or would they
Well,
like to pass it on?
Presenters have an opinion about that. I can understand if they don't or don't want to share it at this point in this context.
If you
Well,
don't,
I
folks,
think it's a
yeah.
good thing for a congregation to discuss. I think it's difficult. I would imagine it would be difficult to require that of everybody, but I also think with conversation, more people would understand that it would make life easier in the long run. And
Yeah.
you've just reminded me that I've been wanting to do that with my own name and I haven't done it. And so I thank you for that. It's related. It definitely is related. It's not,
Okay.
it's not the exact same thing. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, Katie O'Hare Gibson does it here. But at Fallen, everybody does.
Jane, unmute, please. Jane Beswick, unmute.
I just wanted to say, this is very moving. I kind of feel tearful. I'm very impressed, and I'm very, very moved about taking the time to explore your feelings and share with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Meg Newhouse.
Yeah, I first want to just encourage people to use the raise hand if they can, because it's so much easier to see. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you for the authenticity, the honesty, the courage, the thoughtfulness. I think it's so important that we do this. And one of the takeaways think is really important is the importance of deep, non-judgmental listening, which none of us is practice at mostly. And the importance of making time for these things, which really trump so much else. If you don't have a good relationship, you can't effectively do much else. So thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Did someone's hand? Oh, Elsie.
Elsie's was.
Elsie, yeah. Would you unmute Elsie? Elsie Petty?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Go ahead, Elsie.
My thought was, thank you. And I'm very happy to actually see the staff people that I've spoken to and haven't actually seen. So thank you. My philosophy is to ask people how they want to be addressed. And I remember at the first meeting where Anne introduced herself, I did ask her how she would like to be addressed, and she said, Anne, just Anne. And my daughter and son, my son and daughter-in-law asked how I wanted to be addressed as a grandmother. And again, I was able to say grandmom, although my daughter-in-law addresses her mother by her first name. So this has been my philosophy: ask people how they want to be addressed. And my other thought is that if you are in a foreign culture, I like to conform to whatever that culture expects. If I visit Japan and they want me to wear a skirt, I'll do that. If they want me to take my shoes off, I do that. You know, it's just, I think it's, for me, I feel comfortable being conforming to the culture where I am. So I don't know if that's a good philosophy or not.
Thank you, Elsie. Tony Tasker.
Could I respond to that just
Sure,
a minute though?
sure. Sorry, yes,
The
of
thing
course.
is, if you are in a pluralistic culture, like we say we are here, what is the culture? The culture ought to be kind of multidimensional. Unfortunately, it's mostly the culture of white people. So that's the rub with that, asking people, what is our culture? Is it, that's the question that I think is underneath that as well.
You're right.
Tony Tasker.
In some languages, you have a formal and an informal you, like in vous and tu, and well, what is it in German? Du and
Z.
And I wondered if Mia and Pratik, when you change to calling Mia Mia instead of Mrs. Roop, is there something, and also Mia, when you heard him call you that, was there a difference in the way you felt about that relationship? Because when you tutoyer, when you speak to someone using a tu, it's an acknowledgement that you have a closer relationship. And the same thing, there's a song even in German about going to the du. So I just wondered if you felt anything different in the relationship when you changed to being addressed as Mia and calling Mia by her first name.
Mia or Pratik?
Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Mia.
Okay. That was one of the problems with him calling me Mrs. Roop. I felt like he was putting me above him, and that didn't feel comfortable. And ironically, I speak Spanish, and because I'm lazy, I pretty much do the informal to everyone. But I apologize. I tell the Spanish speaking person that I'm not going to use usted, even though I should. So.
How about after the conversation, Mia? Did your feelings change?
Honestly, Pratik, it just sort of washes over me now. I'm beyond the conversation, and whatever Pratik wants to call me is fine. It doesn't grate on me. It just feels right, whatever he calls me.
Thank you. Pratik, do you respond?
Yes,
we'll go
correct. One of the things that was, very unique with, Mia joining us was that she was a member. She is, part of the church, and she stepped in as an interim. And I do call Rip or Lisa Maria because, they are my colleagues. And I used to call Bob when he was here, our sexton, Bob. So when I started calling, instead of, Miss Roop, I started calling her Mia. Yes, I definitely felt a certain closeness to her as a colleague, because, our offices are so close, and, we sometimes, we'll yell, hey, Pratik, can you come here? I want to check this. Or, I'll say, Miss Mia, can you come here and check this for me? So yes, there is, the collegiality. And I felt like, yes, that definitely helped, my relationship with her. And Mia is just such a wonderful, caring person, that making sure that I was not hurting her, even unintentionally. I know that my intentions were pure when I used to call her, Miss Roop. But I also wanted to take responsibility for the impact that it was having as well. And one of the things that, happened in this conversation was, if people came up to me and asked me to, kind of change my format or, have them refer, I would have to literally memorize all the, the entire directory and what their preference was. So, I also wanted to, keep my life a little bit easier. So I wanted to, stick to one way of, when I'm expressing, and I completely get that. Like, as congregants, they may not want to know that other people have doctorates within the congregation. But at the same time, I'm not a congregant here. This is not my community. I work for this community and I serve this community. So, it was a professional decision that I came to, with discussions, with my fellow staff and Reverend Nan. So, yes, to answer your question, Dr. Tasker, I do feel close when I call Mia Mia. I certainly do. And it's totally different now, from and something that I learned is like, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And these conversations were not comfortable, at least not for me. I can, I don't want to speak for the other women as well. But I learned, how important and integral, and I am so pleased and so happy with what came out of it. So in certain ways, I'm glad that, I brought this culture and I kind of like, stayed a little stubborn or adamant or, just kind of, respecting my own roots. And at the same time, I got to see it from another angle, another dimension.
Thank you, Pratik. We'll go to Helen and Don Cohen, and then we'll go to Jim and Deborah after them. Thank you, Pratik.
Thank you, David. I want to support what people have been saying. I just admire the three of you so very much for the example that you're setting. I mean, very courageous that you stuck with this. Kathleen, I just admire your ability so much to open things up and allow people to talk to each other. Two things in what you did, both being open with each other and direct and taking time. I mean, these two things are so, and listening, all that. They're so essential to human beings getting along with each other. And I think of the church as the place where this can happen, and we can learn so much and get to know so many interesting people and so much about life that we, wouldn't know otherwise if we didn't talk to people that we disagreed with sometimes. I think of conversation as central to being in church, and that we're all so fortunate to have a community like this. And I'm tearful too. Somebody said that earlier. I'm tearful because of what you've taught us, what you've provided an example of. So I thank you very much.
Don, do you have a comment or question?
Oh, Helen spoke for both of us. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go to Deborah Lawson and Jim Matheson. Would you unmute, please? There you go.
Well, in light, I find this conversation so interesting. And because we just automatically call each other like whatever we call each other, without really asking the person what it is they want to be called. So my question is for Pratik. Do you mind that everyone calls you Pratik, or would you rather the formal Mr. Mamtora?
I am comfortable both ways, to be honest. And one of the things that, I'm comfortable with being called Pratik is because that's, the culture here. And I want to, allow people to, be part of their culture and follow what their culture asks them to do. And if they call me Mr. Mamtora, because one of the things that, because I teach the class now, so I always call Dr. Seaswell, Tony Seaswell. He's one of my, fellow teachers in the Hogwarts class. And there's this whole culture of the professors and the prefects. So he always calls me, Mr. Mamtora or Professor Mamtora. So in that setting, it works perfectly. So, I feel like if, that is something that people want to do, I feel comfortable either way.
Thank you. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, no, it was just Deborah's.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Larry Roop, and then Meg Lashak.
Hey, boy, I am proud of this congregation right now. And I don't agree with everything everybody said on either side, but I have my own feelings of why I like to be called Larry. And that's very personal to me and important to me. But I've learned from this too. But my feeling is, and I don't speak for anybody else, is I'd like to embrace you more into our community, Pratik. So it's hard to pull you in when I have to call you, you have to call me Mr. Roop, and I want to hug you and bring you into our congregation and to our eighth principle talks, because we need BIPOC voices. So I'll tell you a little bit about my aversion to being called Mr. and Sir. I've read a lot of history. I know that violence was perpetuated against people in the South, Blacks, who didn't say sir to a white person. So, that and my own personal history, which I won't get into, but I was never meant to offend your culture in any way. But I'm always going to insist that you call me Larry. Still, you'll eventually decide to hate me or to wear you down, but I want to pull you in. That's how I do it. Okay, that's all I'm saying. But what a beautiful presentation. This is a difficult conversation. I'm so proud of all of you.
Thank you, Larry, very much. Meg Lashak, unmute, please.
Did that do it? Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Meg.
One of the things that occurred to me was, let's see. I have an idealized picture of some aspects of Native American culture. And one of those, I'm going to say idealized because I don't know the reality. I only know what I've read in some fictional stories and some articles and stories written by Native American people. But there seems to be an aspect of being able to take this kind of time and listen, and that it seems to be a deeply ingrained part of that culture. And what I was thinking of was how different it is if, when there's conflict, you don't have to react by feeling as if you're being attacked. You don't have to react as if you're going to get into a confrontation where there has to be a winner and a loser or victory and shame. It's very different if you can think of conflict as something to be explored, sort of like, well, that's interesting. And that have the sense that over time you will explore it and talk about it and slowly learn why one point of view is important to one person and what's under the point of view for the other person. And you have to, I guess I'm thinking you have to feel safe. This has to happen in a cultural setting where you do feel safe. And it's wonderful that our church can provide that. I don't think it's something that we have much of in the society at large at this time. But I do think that various groups of people do try to set up situations where conflict can be addressed, not as a confrontation, not as an accusation. And I feel as if Kathleen and Pratik and Mia all provided a wonderful example of what can happen when you can take the risk of stepping into the exploration.
Thank you, Meg, very much. Meg Newhouse, you need to unmute. Meg, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Meg Lashak. That was beautiful. I am risking something to put you on the spot, Reverend, or just plain Kathleen. Do you have a preference?
Truthfully, no. It doesn't matter to me. So even in my own self, I sometimes sign an email Kathleen, sometimes Reverend Kathleen. I really don't. I really don't. I'm wondering, I think when I first started out as a woman minister, at first, the first decade, I think I pressed more for the Reverend piece, but it doesn't matter to me now.
That's
It
great.
doesn't bother me when people call me it either. I don't, it's about, yeah, I'm sort of like Mia is now about, but thank you for asking.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment also on the just the aspect of this whole story that it happened on your very first day here. And thank God you were experienced and weren't, you know.
Yeah,
Wow.
what I wonder if it was your first week ever as a minister, how I would have handled that. I have no idea.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Newhouse, because this conversation could have gone in several different ways. And, you know, Reverend Kathleen, to have that kind of wisdom to just kind of, you know, be that container literally and hold that space and allow us to be uncomfortable and still share how, you know, all the different places that we came from. And I know we know the analogy of, you know, blindfolded or blind men trying to touch an elephant and trying to describe what the object is. And everybody's touching at different, you know, places. So they think that this is their truth. And, you know, for Reverend Kathleen to kind of, you know, hold that space where she allowed all the different dimensions and, you know, literally have the conversation shift the paradigm, like she mentioned in earlier, that was a true gift.
But thank you. And both Mia and Pratik are sophisticated in these matters intellectually. I mean, Pratik, I mean, both of them. I mean, Mia's done all sorts of things out in the world around race and culture and so forth, and Pratik as well. So I think making a container under those circumstances has to be said. It's easier than, and I had my moments of needing a container too. So as we talked, so.
Thank you. Omar Kudari. Unmute, Omar.
Yeah, this is going to be tricky. 1 second.
There you go. Then we'll go to Margot Shaw and then Larry.
Okay. I have 2 comments that maybe you can comment about or not, but they're just comments. One is that we've been reminded a lot that if we value multiculturalism and we value diversity, we have to be willing to be changed ourselves. And this congregation does a lot of hand-wringing about how we lack diversity and how we are very undiverse. And it's been told to us many times, and sometimes it's hard to remember that, hey, it's sort of be careful what you wish for, because if you really wish for diversity, you're talking about changing yourself, and not just about getting other people to come and join us and mold to our ways. So that was one comment. The other comment is that I feel like this is such a tricky form of address, because there's plenty of behaviors that are pretty clearly, like what I wear should be up to me, not up to you if you think this is inappropriate. Mostly, but I mean, then we also have cultural rules about, wow, that's a really revealing, outfit that you're wearing. And, I know maybe it's your culture, but it's affecting me. A form of address really does affect me. It can make me feel bad. It can hurt me. Like, I mean, it's an inappropriate analogy, but there are other types of behaviors that are clearly inappropriate, like touching. Like if someone said, in my culture, we touch everybody else, and people might feel like, I don't want to be touched. I don't want you touching me. We would feel like that would be perfectly appropriate to say, keep that, away. And this is just so tricky because it's kind of like a borderline thing. And it is your behavior. It's like wearing your hijab or something like that. It's like, what, it's not me that's, that's behaving, it's you that's behaving. And so it's you who should own it. But then again, it's not completely not affecting the other person. But then I go back to, hey, we want diversity. We should be willing to change. Not only willing to change, we should want to change. We should want and celebrate, as you said before, diversity. So it wasn't really a question, but just a couple of comments.
Thank you, Omar. Margot, Margot Shaw, then Ruth, and then Larry, since you've been up at bat once, we'll go to Ruth after Ruth.
Hi all. I don't speak
Margot Shaw.
I don't speak very easily off the cuff, but I'll try. I just first want to say I so admire all three of you, like people have said here, to be so public about this. And you realize this whole subject, not just how you address somebody, this whole subject is so deep and there's so many levels to it. It would take us years to come to grips with it. And so I can see why you have a lot of catchphrases like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, etc. And I learned that way back when I went with the Friends Service Committee to Mexico one summer on a service trip. And the pre-meetings had all about to do with exactly what you've been talking about here today. What is expected, what you need to learn about the culture. And in my case, we were way up in the mountains and it was totally different than, say, you were going to go to Mexico City. But anyway, we would then have our experience. And at the end, we had a, whatever you call it, feedback day with the committee to see what did you expect and what did you learn? And so much of it was exactly what you've been talking about here. I wanted to, and I wanted to ask you, Kathleen, is that how you call yourself? Kathleen? Madam Reverend.
No.
Anyway,
well, that's fine.
I missed a little bit of the feedback when everybody started talking, but I was wondering why you put your remarks in or explained this in terms of race, of Black and white. I don't look at as Black and white at all. I don't think it has anything to do with color or anything else. And so I was just curious where maybe it's your background in having worked with race relations.
I think it's I think it's more dominant culture, not dominant culture, marginalized, not marginalized, which in this instance did have both culture and there were many isms there, if you will, but it's more, I guess, about if we want to be multicultural and all of those things we say, then we have to look at what the dominant culture believes that might not be helpful in that goal. That's all. I think this did have to do with race in some ways. How could it not?
but not, yeah, marginalized, I understand, but not color.
Well, let's ask Pratik if he feels, if he feels that it was a dimension here or not. Maybe.
Yes, I think race does play an important, part in this, because if you know the roles were reversed, or if I were white, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
I kind of doubt that. It's a cultural thing. It isn't, and only because, Kathleen, you were talking so much and using the word white. White doesn't necessarily, in what we're talking about here, maybe it creates a superiority sense, and maybe in the white person, but I don't think, anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, I respectfully disagree, but we would have to talk longer to really understand each other, I think. Yeah. And I'm willing to do that if you want to, but yeah, for me, it's around what assumptions come mostly out of the white culture here that get all mixed up in all the other stuff. But you're right, you could have disagreements about culture that don't have anything to do with race. That's surely true. Religion is another place, Are we allowed to pray in Congress or are we not? Well, maybe that's not a good example, but I do agree in that place of there are other ways in which we need to have these conversations that don't have to do with race.
Right. And I want to say, one last thing really quickly.
A quickie, right. Thank you, Margot.
One last thing.
a quickie, a really quickie, because our time is up and we have one more person.
I want to show this book, this practice up, because it's directly in line with what you have done, Kathleen, and what you continue to do. And it's called, can you see it? The connection practice. And this is the 3 words that Rita Marie Johnson, who put this program together, says is that empathy plus insight equals connection. And she has a whiteboard with magnetic words, et cetera, and a very simplistic way of, for instance, if Pratik and Mia were discussing this issue right now, you could use this board and hopefully come to some solutions. Anyway,
thank you. Could we do that? You're welcome. Thank you, Margot. Deborah and Jim, if I don't know which one, I'm not going to ask you to speak, but could you put it in chat? I will make a copy of the chat and I'll make sure that our 3 speakers get a copy of the chat. Same with Laura Rosen. If you are still listening, put it in the chat. I'll copy the chat and send it. And Ruth, we've a little over our time, but if it's a quickie, and unmute and you can ask your question or make your comment.
Yeah, I'm basically fine. I kept thinking as you all were talking about widening the circle, because that's an effort that we're making as a congregation. And this was kind of a primer for at least one aspect of that. And on forms of address, if you are my age, after a while, you just let honey and dear run right off.
Pratik and Mia, did I not say that in one of our hours? I used to bother me, and now call me honey. I'll say, oh, I'll take it.
Well, thank you, Reverend Kathleen. Thank you, Pratik Mamtora. Thank you, Mia Roop, and thank you everyone who was here for your wonderful comments and questions. Tune in next week, but hold this one in your heart, because this was an important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.